Hi, I will be talking to you today about measuring up, an activity that I found in Module 4, and I am modifying it to meet the needs of my students. Due to personal contact being a sensitive issue, I have chosen to use stuffed animals instead of having my students test each other by measuring their height and arm spans. And as you can see, here is a photograph of some of the stuffed animals that I would have students use to do the tests of arm span and height. I would like to differentiate this activity with my students based on their levels of ability. For many of the students, they will be doing the arm span and height measurements, but some students can go above and beyond and can choose another relationship to study. They could do the length of the forearm or hand span in comparison to the height. On day 1, students have been presented with the question, is there a relationship between arm span and height? Notice that I've underlined arm span and height because due to differentiation, I am allowing students to change that if they so desire to do that. And one thing they will keep in mind is when they do the measurements, all students will be focusing on inches. After presenting students with the question, I have asked them to predict, do you think there's a relationship between arm span and height? Definitely they needed to explain that, how they came up with the idea that arm span and height have a relationship or don't have a relationship. After giving their predictions, students needed to create a proposal. In that proposal, they have been presented with the following questions. What is your method of testing your prediction? What tools will you need? How will you collect and represent your data? And explain. Throughout the process of completing this activity, I have presented students with examples of how they can complete the activity, samples of some of the tables they can use and how they would collect data, but it is ultimately up to the students to decide if they want to, how they want to collect the data and how they want to predict and use tools that they need. So they need to come up with the proposal prior to completing the activity. On day 2, prior to collecting the data, I worked with students on measuring with a ruler. They don't always do that, and I needed to make sure that they understood how to measure with rulers and how to, what the little marks mean on the ruler, and giving them a little quiz to make sure they understand that so they can collect accurate data. After having a mini lesson on how to do measurements, students needed to collect data, and they needed to decide how they wanted to organize their data. Here's a sample chart that I have created that I've shared with students on how they can collect their data, indicating the test subject, the arm span for each subject in inches, and the height in inches as well. Here's an example of Papa Smurf with his height being measured and his arm span. Test subject number 2 was Tigger, measuring his height and his arm span, and all of this data is collected and put on a table. Thirdly, we have Snuggle Bear, his height and his arm span. And Care Bear, his height and his arm span. And finally, the chicken, the height of the chicken in inches, as well as the arm span in inches. After collecting the data, students needed to decide how they were presenting their data. Now, due to the increase in technology in our district, students were expected to create a graph on the computer using the data they collected, and this data was on the data collection section of their handouts. In other words, they needed to graph their data. One thing I need to point out is I have created a handout for students to use to help them through the process of completing this activity. Many of my students would not be able to do all of it on their own. I broke things down into days and explained to them what they needed to do each day, giving them blanks to fill in, sections where they can fill in paragraphs, giving explanations, etc. Prior to summarizing their graphs, students needed to practice finding the mean, median, and mode in sample problems before they found the mean, median, and mode in this activity. Now, we needed to review the definitions of mean, median, and mode to make sure they understood the differences between the 3 terms, and then we practiced them with some sample problems. In their graphs, I reminded students on their handouts that they needed to find the mean, median, and mode for their activity and the data that they collected. Finally, when summarizing their graph, they needed to explain the relationships they saw in the data that they collected. On day 3, students needed to look at all of their data, look at their graphs, and decide if there is a relationship between the arm span and height. In other words, they needed to evaluate their prediction that they made on day 1. They need to look at their explanations for their predictions from day 1 and compare it now to their final explanation and how they're evaluating their prediction. Were they right or were they wrong? What worked well, what didn't, in terms of following their prediction, making it true, or not making it true. And finally, the last thing students needed to do was to share their findings with their classmates. The questions that they needed to ask were, did you find the same results as your classmates? Why or why not? And they needed to explain it. Here's some sample data from the test subjects from this activity, and students needed to communicate with one another to see if they came up with the same conclusions in this activity.